I never planned to become the villain in somebody else's story. But judging by the way people talked about it afterward, you'd think I woke up one morning and decided to destroy a man's pride, his truck, and maybe his reputation all in the same week. The truth is a lot less dramatic and somehow a lot worse. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 41 years old. I live in a suburb outside Fort Collins, Colorado, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person who avoids conflict whenever possible. I'm an environmental engineer. I spend my days solving problems that most people never notice: drainage systems, soil movement, runoff calculations, all the boring, invisible stuff that keeps neighborhoods functioning. I've always believed that if you stay reasonable long enough, eventually other people will be reasonable too. Turns out that's not always true. I bought my house in the spring of 2023. Nothing fancy. Single-story brick ranch, corner lot, big front lawn, mature maple trees. The kind of place where kids still rode bikes after dinner and neighbors waved when they walked their dogs. After my divorce, that house felt like a fresh start. For the first time in years, I had a place that was completely mine. I spent weekends rebuilding flower beds, replacing sprinklers, fixing things the previous owner had ignored. Every dollar I put into that property felt like I was rebuilding part of myself too. Across the street lived a man named Dennis Holloway. Dennis was one of those guys everybody knew. Not because people liked him, because people couldn't avoid him. He owned a local equipment rental company, drove a massive customized diesel pickup that looked big enough to tow a battleship, and somehow managed to make every conversation sound like a speech he was giving to an audience. You know the type. The guy who never walks anywhere. He arrives. The first time I saw his truck cut across my lawn, I honestly thought it was an accident. It happened early one morning. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee when I heard an engine get unusually close to the house. I looked out the window and saw this giant silver truck driving diagonally across my front yard. Not the street, not the driveway, my lawn. I just stood there staring. The truck bounced once over the grass, rolled through the corner of the property, then disappeared down the road. I remember actually laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain couldn't process it. Who does that? The next morning, he did it again. And the morning after that. By the end of the week, 2 dark tire tracks had been carved through brand new sod I'd spent months growing. That was when I decided to say something. I caught Dennis one afternoon while he was unloading equipment from trailer. I walked over, smiled, tried to keep everything friendly. "Hey, Dennis, quick favor." He looked up. "What's up?" "I noticed you've been cutting across my lawn in the mornings. I've just put a lot of work into it. Would you mind sticking to the road?" Simple, respectful, reasonable. Dennis stared at me for a second, then shrugged. "It's faster." I actually thought he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, I laughed again. "Yeah, I get that. But it's private property." He leaned against the trailer. "I've been driving through there for years." That answer stuck with me. Not because it made sense, because it didn't. It was the kind of logic people use when they've gotten away with something long enough that they start believing it belongs to them. I kept my voice calm. "Well, I live there now." Another shrug. "Sure." Then he went back to unloading equipment. For 2 days, everything was quiet. No truck, no tire tracks, nothing. I thought maybe the conversation worked. Maybe that was all it took. Then Friday morning arrived. I heard the diesel engine before I even opened my eyes. A few seconds later came the familiar rumble. Then the sound of heavy tires crushing soft ground. I looked outside. There he was. Same route, same speed, same lawn, like we'd never spoken. That was the moment something changed. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. The realization that this wasn't about convenience anymore. This was about somebody deciding that what belonged to me simply didn't matter. A few days later, I confronted him again. This time he was washing his truck in the driveway. Water running down oversized tires. Country music playing from a speaker somewhere in the garage. "You walked over." "Dennis, we already talked about this." He didn't even look up. "It's grass." 3 words. That's all it took. Because to him it was grass. To me it was respect. Boundaries. Ownership. The basic understanding that another person's property isn't yours to use. I crossed my arms. "I need you to stay off my lawn." Finally he looked up. There was this little smile on his face. Not friendly. Not angry. Amused. Like he was watching a kid try to argue with an adult. Then he asked a question I'll never forget. "Or what?" I stood there for a second. Because honestly, I didn't have an answer. Not then. But as I turned around and walked back toward my house, I realized something important. Dennis wasn't ignoring me because he misunderstood. He understood perfectly. He just didn't think there would ever be consequences. And standing in my driveway that evening, staring at those tire tracks cutting across everything I'd worked for, I began wondering what happens when a man spends so many years getting his way that he forgets the world still has limits. I didn't know it yet, but that question was about to cost him a lot more than a patch of grass. The funny thing is, when people hear how this story ends, they usually assume I immediately started plotting revenge. I didn't. If anything, I spent the next few weeks trying harder than ever to avoid a confrontation. Maybe that sounds naive, but I genuinely believe there had to be some point where common sense would finally catch up with Dennis. I was wrong. The following Saturday, I drove to a hardware store and bought a bundle of wooden landscape stakes. Nothing aggressive, nothing dangerous, just enough to clearly mark the edge of the property where his truck kept cutting through. I spent most of the afternoon installing them. By sunset, the boundary looked obvious, visible, impossible to miss. I remember standing in the yard thinking there. Problem solved. The next morning at 6:07, I heard a crack that sounded like someone breaking baseball bats. I walked to the window. Dennis's truck rolled through the yard without slowing down. The stakes exploded beneath the tires, with fragments scattered across the grass. The truck bounced once and kept going. Didn't stop. Didn't hesitate. Didn't even tap the brakes. That evening, I collected broken pieces from the lawn and piled them in my garage. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like a scientist observing a result. The experiment had produced an answer. The answer was that Dennis knew exactly what he was doing. The following week, I tried landscape edging. Heavy-duty plastic reinforced with metal spikes. Again, clearly visible. Again, impossible to mistake. Again, destroyed within 24 hours. After that, I wrote a note. Not a threatening note. Not an emotional note. Just a simple piece of paper. Please stop driving across my property. Continued trespassing is being documented. I folded it neatly and slipped it under his windshield wiper. The next morning, I watched from my kitchen window as Dennis walked outside, carrying a coffee mug. He noticed the note immediately, pulled it free, read it, then looked directly toward my house. Even from across the street, I could see the smirk. He crumpled the paper into a ball, tossed it into my yard, got into his truck, and drove across the same tire tracks he'd been using for weeks. Something locked into place inside me right then. Not rage, clarity, because misunderstandings can be fixed. Mistakes can be forgiven. Patterns are different. Patterns tell you exactly who you're dealing with. So I stopped talking, and I started documenting. Every morning before work, I took photographs. Same angles, same locations, time-stamped, dated, organized. I photographed the tire tracks, the damaged grass, the ruts getting deeper week after week. I photographed everything. Then I started keeping receipts, replacement sod, repair costs, materials, labor estimates, anything connected to the damage. Within a month, I had a folder thick enough to impress an insurance adjuster. By week 6, I had 53 photographs. For repair estimates, several witness statements from neighbors who had seen the truck crossing the property, and 4 certified letters. Every letter politely requested the same thing. Stop entering private property. Dennis signed for every single one. Ignored every single one. Around that time, one of my neighbors, an older woman named Carol, stopped me while I was mowing. "You know, everybody's talking about this, right?" she asked. I shut off the mower. "Talking about what?" "Dennis." I laughed. "That's never a good sign." She smiled. "Most people think he's pushing you because you're new." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" Carol glanced toward Dennis's house. Nobody's ever really challenged him before. I looked across the street. Dennis was standing in his driveway talking loudly on his phone. "Well," I said, "that's unfortunate." Carol laughed. "You have no idea." That conversation stayed with me, because suddenly the situation made more sense. This wasn't really about my lawn. The lawn was just the stage. The real issue was control. Dennis had spent years behaving however he wanted. People rolled their eyes, complained privately, then moved on. Eventually, he started believing consequences simply didn't apply to him. And honestly, maybe they hadn't, at least not until now. A few days later, I contacted the homeowners association. I already knew it was probably a waste of time, but I wanted the record. The conversation went exactly how you'd expect. I explained the repeated trespassing, the property damage, the documentation, the letters, the photographs. The woman on the phone listened politely. Then she gave me the standard response. This appears to be a dispute between neighbors. I almost laughed. That's it. We recommend attempting direct communication. I stared at the phone. Direct communication. I tried direct communication. I tried polite communication. I tried written communication. At that point, smoke signals would have had the same chance of success. Then I learned something interesting. Dennis happened to be the HOA's finance committee chairman. Imagine my surprise. That call ended quickly. But in hindsight, it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened. Because once that door closed, I stopped looking for someone else to solve the problem. Instead, I started asking a different question. What can I legally do on my own property? That's where my engineering background entered the story. One evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, a stack of municipal codes, and a property survey. Hours passed, then more hours. Most people would have been bored to death. I was fascinated. Land use regulations, drainage improvements, residential excavation guidelines, utility setbacks, permit requirements. I read everything, and eventually I found something interesting. Actually, scratch that. I found something very interesting. Under city regulations, homeowners could install certain drainage improvements on their property without requiring extensive review, provided the work remained within established boundaries and complied with runoff regulations. I read the section twice, then 3 times. Then I opened my survey maps, measured property lines, checked easements, verified setbacks, and somewhere around midnight, an idea started forming. Not revenge, not sabotage, a solution. At least that's how I saw it. Because here's the thing most people don't understand. Property ownership works both ways. Your neighbor doesn't have the right to use your land without permission, but you absolutely have the right to improve your own land, as long as you're following the law. That thought stayed with me for several days, growing, developing, taking shape. Then one morning I looked out the window and watched Dennis cut across the yard yet again. Same route, same confidence, same assumption that nothing would ever change. And for the first time in months, I smiled. Not because I knew exactly what I was going to do, because I finally understood something. I didn't need to stop Dennis. I didn't need an argument. I didn't need the HOA. I didn't need the police. All I needed was to make one completely legal improvement to my property. And if Dennis chose to keep driving across land that didn't belong to him afterward, well, that decision would be entirely his. 3 days later, I made a phone call to a small excavation company I'd worked with before. Good crew, reliable people. The foreman answered on the second ring. I explained the project. Measurements, placement, drainage justification. He listened quietly. Then he said, "When do you want us to start?" I looked through the window toward the tire tracks carved across my front yard. For the first time in weeks, they didn't irritate me anymore. They looked like a blueprint. "Tomorrow morning," I said. And as I hung up the phone, I had a feeling that after months of being ignored, the next chapter of this story was going to be impossible for Dennis Holloway to overlook. The excavation crew arrived just after sunrise. By 8 a.m., orange markers were scattered across my yard, and the area where Dennis's truck always crossed had been measured 3 separate times. I wasn't taking chances. Every line was verified against the property survey. Every measurement was documented. Every requirement was checked. If this thing ever ended up in front of a judge, I wanted the facts doing the talking, not me. The work itself took 2 days. From the street, it probably looked boring. A drainage improvement project. Nothing more, nothing less. But standing there watching it take shape, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The crew excavated a deep trench along the precise path Dennis had carved through my lawn for nearly 2 months. Landscape fabric went in first, then loose aggregate, then a temporary support layer designed specifically for the drainage installation. Finally, fresh sod was carefully laid across the surface. From a distance, the lawn looked completely normal. Green, clean, finished. The only difference was what existed underneath. When the crew left, I walked the property one final time. Checked the survey markers. Checked the paperwork. Checked everything. Then I waited. The strange thing about waiting is that it's harder than action. For weeks I've been doing something. Taking pictures. Writing letters. Making calls. Now, there was nothing left to do but watch. The first day passed quietly. No truc. The second day passed too. Still nothing. By the third morning, I actually started wondering if Dennis had finally gotten the message. Maybe he'd seen the construction. Maybe he decided it wasn't worth it. Maybe the story was simply going to end with everyone moving on. Then Thursday morning arrived. 6:11 a.m. I was standing in my kitchen holding a coffee mug. The same kitchen. The same window. The same spot where this whole ridiculous saga had started. And then I heard it. That familiar diesel rumble. Low at first, then louder. Getting closer. I remember smiling before I even saw the truck. Not because I wanted something bad to happen. Because I knew exactly what was about to happen. A few seconds later, the silver pickup appeared. Moving confidently. Moving fast. Following the exact same line it had followed dozens of times before. And then, the ground disappeared. The sound wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a crash. It was more like the earth suddenly exhaled. A deep, hollow collapse followed by an explosive thud. The front of the truck dropped instantly. 1 second it was moving. The next second it wasn't. The front wheels vanished downward. The suspension slammed. The undercarriage hit hard. And the entire truck pitched forward at an angle so steep it looked unreal. For a moment, everything went silent. Then came the revving. Dennis hit the accelerator. The rear tires spun wildly. Grass, dirt, and gravel sprayed through the air. But the truck wasn't going anywhere. Every second he stayed on the gas, only buried it deeper. I stepped outside. Several neighbors were already opening doors. One garage door rolled upward. Then another. People were appearing like they'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. The driver's door flew open. Dennis jumped out. His face was bright red. The kind of red that starts in the neck and climbs upward. "What the hell is this?" he yelled. I set my coffee on the porch railing. "A drainage project." His eyes nearly popped out of his head. "A drainage project?" "Yep. You dug a damn hole." I nodded. "On my property." For a second I thought he might actually explode. He pointed toward the truck. "My truck is ruined." I looked at the vehicle. The front end was buried. The rear wheels sat awkwardly on the grass. Fluid was already dripping underneath. It definitely didn't look healthy. Then Dennis took several angry steps toward me. "You did this on purpose." I shrugged. Dennis immediately pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "Okay." "I'm calling my lawyer." "Okay." That answer seemed to frustrate him even more. Because people like Dennis thrive on resistance. Arguments. Emotion. Drama. And I wasn't giving him any. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers. Professional. Neutral. The older officer approached me first. "Can you explain what's going on?" I handed him a folder. Inside were photographs. Certified mail receipts. Property surveys. Construction permits. Documentation. Weeks and weeks of documentation. He flipped through the pages while his partner inspected the property. Meanwhile, Dennis talked nonstop. Negligence. Liability. Dangerous conditions. Lawsuits. Every legal word he'd probably heard on television. The officers listened, and they kept reading. The longer they read, the quieter they became. Eventually, the older officer closed the folder, looked at Dennis, then asked one simple question. "Sir, were you authorized to drive across this property?" The silence that followed was beautiful. Not because Dennis looked embarrassed, because for the first time since this started, somebody had asked the only question that actually mattered. Dennis tried to answer. Started talking about shortcuts, history, neighborhood habits, convenience. The officer held up a hand. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Then came the answer. "No." The officer nodded. And just like that, the entire argument collapsed. The tow truck arrived later that morning. A massive recovery vehicle. Even with professional equipment, it took hours to extract the pickup. Every pull produced another awful metallic noise. Every adjustment seemed to reveal new damage. By the time they finally got it free, the truck looked exhausted. A few weeks later, I heard the repair estimate was somewhere around $12,000. Insurance refused coverage. The reason was simple: unauthorized operation of a vehicle on private property. In other words, Dennis had become the author of his own problem. Then came the part nobody expected. Pictures started circulating online. Somebody posted the truck nose down in the collapsed lawn. Then someone else shared it. Then another. Within days, half the town had seen it. People added captions, jokes, memes. The The story spread far beyond our neighborhood. Dennis hated every second of it. About a month later, a for sale sign appeared in front of his house. No announcement, no farewell, no dramatic exit speech, just a sign, then a moving truck. Then he was gone. The family that moved in afterward couldn't have been more different. The first weekend after they arrived, the new owner walked across the street carrying a six-pack of root beer. He introduced himself. We talked for 20 minutes. Before leaving, he glanced toward my lawn and laughed. I heard the legend before I bought the house. I laughed too, because at that point it had become a legend. One built entirely on choices. Not mine, his. Today the grass is perfect again. No tire tracks, no arguments, no diesel engine cutting through the morning silence. Just a quiet neighborhood and a lawn that finally gets treated like it belongs to someone. But every now and then I still think about that question Dennis asked me months earlier. Or what? Back then I didn't have an answer. Now I do. The answer wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even punishment. The answer was consequences. And consequences have a funny way of showing up exactly when people become convinced they'll never face any. Now here's what I'd love to know from you. Have you ever dealt with someone who kept pushing boundaries because they believed nobody would stop them? When consequences finally arrived, did it feel like justice, or did it feel like the situation had gone too far? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always have two sides, and sometimes the most interesting part isn't what happened. It's where people draw the line between standing up for yourself and becoming part of the problem.